We've discussed some of the philosophers, and of course, there's many, many more, but I just gave you some to introduce some key concepts like nativism, rationalism, empiricism, and so forth. That gets us to the start of psychology as a field. And think about that first for a second. To start psychology as a field, you first have to recognize that it's actually useful and interesting and meaningful to approach the study of the human mind and of people as an actual scientific endeavor. This happened basically simultaneously in both the United States as well as in Europe. So here are the two main guys who started this from the ground up. Those were Wilhelm Wundt in Germany on the left, and then William James, sorry, they're almost the same first name, William James, of course, in the United States. In 1879, Wundt started the first psychological laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, and he was really interested in the nature of mental behavior, meaning what are the molecules that make up thinking. This was heavily inspired by physics, and of course, at the time, they were starting to really understand particles and their interactions, and how if you put different substances together, you get different reactions and so forth. Well, Wundt thought that maybe if we can identify the building blocks of thinking, almost like molecules, then we can study the interaction of those building blocks, and that will give us a better understanding of mental processes. How did Wundt do this? We have to recognize here that also at the time, there really weren't fully developed scientific methods for how to study the mind. This was all very new, very difficult to do, and a lot of it was based on traditional philosophy, where they just wanted to get away from only thinking about it, but actually trying to get some sort of way of recording what the brain and the mind were doing. Wilhelm Wundt relied mostly on the notion of introspection. Introspection is a method where basically you sit in a chair and you think to yourself, well, what does a house look like? And you start analyzing your own mental process as you're trying to conjure up an image of a house. And Wundt did this a lot and wrote down all sorts of observations as he was introspecting about his own mental processes. Now, there are some obvious problems with this, because first of all, if I ask all of you as a class to think of what a house looks like, all of you guys are going to come up with a slightly different image. Some of you guys may come up with the house you currently live in, maybe your childhood home, maybe some other house down the block. Every single one of those houses is going to look slightly differently. So introspection by today's standards wouldn't really pass the test of a rigorous scientific method. But again, you got to keep in mind that these guys were developing this method and the way of studying the brain and the mind without having any sort of shoulders to stand on yet, because all of this needed to be developed. And in fact, in many ways, they are the shoulders that we stand on today. And because of their work and their thinking, we are able to study psychology in the way we do nowadays. So that's Wilhelm Wundt. On the other hand, William James in the United States, much more focused on the function of the mind. What is it good for? And James was heavily inspired by evolution. It's not surprisingly so, right? If you look at evolutionary processes, a core idea is that traits that are somehow adaptive in the environment will survive and reproduce, and traits that are not so adaptive will eventually die off. He thought of thinking and mental processes in similar ways. He just wanted to know what kind of thinking is productive, what kind of thinking is not productive, what kind of strategies lead to people being better able to remember stuff, what kind of strategies are not working so well, and so forth. So this notion of studying what mental functions are good for is known as the idea of functionalism. How does the mind work? Rather than structuralism on this end, how is the mind structured? Both important approaches. Now, if we then fast forward, behaviorism came in the 1920s, 1930s, and it was almost a reaction against the unobservable. People were getting fed up with this idea of introspection and trying to study things that we can't actually see. And instead, what behaviorists thought was, let's just focus on the actual behavior, right? What kind of things are people actually doing? And study those. We don't have to ascribe to mental representations that we can't even see. We're just going to look at behavioral output. And if we analyze that carefully, we can come to understand how behavior actually works. The tradition of behaviorism really has two main names attached to it that really started that field. Of course, it has grown tremendously. As some of you guys might in fact work with applied behavioral analysis. It's used a lot in treatment of people with autism, of all sorts of disorders. It's used in organizational behaviors and so forth. But it all relies on some core ideas of behaviorism. And the two main people were John Watson, who is really well known for the experiment of little Albert. I'll say some more about that in a second. And then the second one is B.F. Skinner, who's very well known for what's called operant conditioning and the Skinner box. So first of all, John Watson. As I said, John Watson was famous for his little Albert experiment. And in that experiment, what he did was the following, was quite mean. He took a little child by the name of Albert and showed little Albert a bunch of soft, white, fluffy animals. And originally, little Albert was perfectly happy interacting with these animals, like a rat and a rabbit and so forth, until Watson systematically started pairing the white rat being shown with a very, very loud bang of a gong right next to his head. So every time little Albert now saw the rat, there was this enormously loud noise that was very aversive, and little Albert became averse of it. Little Albert, by the way, was only 9 months old at the time. Now, what's interesting is that Watson then showed that because of this pairing between this white fluffiness and this really negative stimulus, this loud noise, little Albert actually became afraid of pretty much anything that was white and furry. A cute white little bunny. The researchers had a coat that was white and furry. In fact, the child actually became afraid of Santa Claus's beard even. So by doing so, Watson managed to demonstrate that there's pairings between stimuli and responses, and that as people pair these things, you can actually get an account of how behavior works. So people become afraid because there's some sort of pairing of something that might be perfectly fine, but it's paired with something very negative. Now they become afraid of what was originally perfectly fine. Watson saw this as a demonstration that he could basically mold children into anything that you could think of. He could make them lawyers, he could make them thieves and so forth. In fact, he is famous for the quote that goes as follows: "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of its talents, pensions, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." So that's interesting. Watson is essentially arguing against nativism and saying babies don't come pre-equipped with anything. I can make them anything I want by just changing the environment and the experiences they have, and that's going to drive their behavior. That's John Watson. And famous interesting side note about John Watson too is actually that at some point he actually got fired from Johns Hopkins University because John Watson decided to start dating a graduate student and eventually got married to that student. At the time, that was heavily frowned upon to the point that he lost his faculty position. Now you might think, oh, poor John Watson, but what did Watson actually do? Well, Watson had just spent a bunch of times figuring out how you could make people do certain things by subjecting them to certain stimuli. He thought, this means that I can also maybe influence what people buy and don't buy, and if I manage to do that successfully, I can actually make a lot of money. So John Watson actually, after being fired from Johns Hopkins, decided to start one of the first advertising companies and came up with the entire idea of advertising, where basically something you have positive feelings towards gets paired with some sort of product, and then people will start buying that product more often. So Watson ended up being very, very wealthy and was just fine after being fired. That's John Watson. Now there's B.F. Skinner, and Skinner is very well known for operant conditioning, as I already said. Operant conditioning is all about making an animal produce a certain behavior by either rewarding it or punishing it. So this is all about reward and punishment. He used the Skinner box for this, where he basically would put a rat in a certain box, and depending on which lever they would press, they would either get a shock as a punishment or they would get a juice reward. And then he would study how that behavior would change over time, depending on how all of this was rewarded or punished. So behaviorism was extremely successful between the 1920s and the 1950s or so. But at some point, people started to have some serious reservations about the ability for behaviorism to really account for all human behavior in the broadest sense. I'll discuss some of the challenges that arose next.